Kia ora mai tātou, tēnā tātou katoa. Members, when we broke for the dinner adjournment, we had just completed the voting on part 6, and so now the question is that new part 7 stand part, and it is Materia Ture's tabled amendment inserting the new part 7.
Mr. Chair.
Materia Ture.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm very pleased to offer this additional housing solution to the House tonight as part of the large suite of housing solutions offered by the opposition in response to government's failure to do anything about the housing crisis. So this is the 7th of the proposals put forward. This one, sir, comes from a piece of work that the Greens did before the budget. So in May of this year, where we announced our homes, not cars policy, which was to allow Housing New Zealand to retain both its tax and its dividend for the purposes of building state houses. Now, at the time that we made that announcement, there was a very acute, just a beginning of that acute awareness of the extent to which the homelessness crisis was hitting New Zealanders. And we had in the Greens the enormous privilege of having a young woman, Rhiannon, come and tell her story with us at the launch of that policy. Now, she was a young mother of 3 children, one of whom has lung disease, young Emma. And Rhiannon was incredibly courageous in telling her story to the New Zealand public, opening herself to potential abuse and judgment. But she talked about it with her courage and with her concern for her daughter with her. She talked about how a redundancy, a relationship breakup, having to move from a rental home that was being sold. She found herself in this terrible situation of having 3 children, one of whom was terribly ill and in hospital, and having nowhere to live but her car. And as she said at the time, she felt she could live in a car if that was what was necessary, but she couldn't take her very sick daughter to live in a car. She talked about the 6 medications that her daughter needed every day that needed to be refrigerated, which of course she couldn't do in a car. So she was having to share her children out amongst friends and family, move Emma in and out of hospital, where she had, sometimes with her sleeping on friends' couches, sometimes back in the hospital. Her homelessness situation was acute. Now, after the announcement of our policy, which is now set out here in Part 7, New Zealanders actually came to the party and she was offered rental accommodation and was able to secure stable accommodation. And for that, we were very grateful, and so was she, to New Zealanders' generosity and kindness. But she shouldn't have to rely on the kindness of strangers, because that's what she had to rely on to find a home. She should have been able to go to the agencies, the services of Housing New Zealand, and talk to them about her story and show them, what her needs were, and they should have been able to find her house. That is what the state housing system was built for, to make sure that young women like her, with her young children, have a house to live in, where she could take care of her sick daughter who has lung cancer. But, as we all know, Housing New Zealand, under this government, has been required to pay a dividend and tax, until very recently, exposed by Stephen Joyce, of course, has been required to pay a dividend and tax. They've had state housing being sold, and so there are not enough state houses for the families who desperately need them, like Rhiannon's. This amendment, sir, this change to the principle to the Housing Corporation Act is quite a modest change. What it does is it will free up Housing New Zealand's obligation to pay a dividend. So it's not the tax part. That requires quite a bit more change. But this Part 7 will enable Housing New Zealand to no longer have to pay a dividend into the government's general coffers, but instead to retain that surplus and use that for the purposes of building state houses that families like Rhiannon's need. And this is critical because we have 2,500 state houses have been sold off under this government. We have 4,500 people on the waiting list. We have the lowest number of state houses per population since 1949. I mean, an absolute disgrace, and the destruction of the state housing system that has provided the safety net for thousands, tens of thousands of New Zealanders over many, many, many decades. Mr Chair.
Materia Ture, but before I allow her to continue with her call, she'd just be seated for a moment, I'll just make the point that she spent 4 minutes 30 before she talked about what her amendment was going to do, what this part was going to do about retaining a dividend and applying it to the purchase of new houses. So I urge her to stay on point in her second call and to talk to the part that we're discussing at the moment. Thank you,
Mr Chair. Of course, Rhiannon's story is very specifically about, is very specifically connected to this Part 7. Because Part 7 will enable more state houses to be built, modest proposal as it is, so that women like her, mothers like her, will have a place to live. And I think that is an important story to tell in this House. We have to remember that housing issues are not intellectual issues, they're not pointy-headed policy issues, they are about the ability for ordinary New Zealanders to live an ordinary, decent life. And our job in Parliament is to provide, through amendments like the one I've put on the table today, to provide the structure, the infrastructure, the funding to enable that decent life to be supported for New Zealanders. So, sir, this provision will mean that the surplus of Housing New Zealand will not have to be sent directly back to government for them to use as they choose, but reinvested in Housing New Zealand to build more homes. Now, it is modest. And I think that that's important, and I think that's not only important to note, but it's important to recognise that even modest changes to the law can make a significant difference, because this means around 250, possibly even, if depending on the nature of the building, 300 new state houses every year. Now, it is a small step towards the many thousands that we need, but every single tool to fix this housing crisis is needed. And this is one of those tools. We can free up this financial opportunity for Housing New Zealand in order to build more state houses. Because as I said, sir, we have the lowest number of state houses per population since 1949.
There you go.
While 4,500 people are on the waiting list. Now let's just reflect for a moment on the 4,500 on the waiting list, because 10 times that many are technically homeless in this country. 10 times that many do not have a safe, secure home to call their own. And the core function we would have thought of Housing New Zealand, and in fact of government, is to make sure that all New Zealand families have a decent, safe and secure home to call their own. So while we have 4,500 on the State House waiting list, we have 10 times that number who are in desperate housing or severe housing need. And so actually the State House waiting list is just a very, very tiny proportion of the people who actually need to be housed in this country. And we need to remember that as we go through. That is why all of the previous tools that have been put forward by the opposition and voted down by the government, but the ones that put forward by the opposition have been so important for us to discuss over the last number of hours. Because these are the solutions that will house New Zealanders, including this one, to enable Housing New Zealand to increase its State House building program by at least another 250, perhaps even 300 homes in a year. And let's not forget how much the forecast dividend was. Like, Stephen Joyce did, as I understand it, agree with our policy, and we appreciate that he agreed with our policy, using Twitter to announce his new policy framework that he would not require a dividend of Housing New Zealand. It was such a modern announcement. It was very hip. It was very social media. It's the new way.
There's one.
Yeah, a very modern way of communicating his new policy.
What a minister of building.
And so we are very pleased that our government has done it for at least for this year and possibly for next year. But there is no justification for Housing New Zealand ever having to provide a dividend to the government. The Housing New Zealand has a core function for providing housing services to the country. Providing rental housing is principally for those who need it is one of the core functions of Housing New Zealand. And in doing that is an expensive service. You have to build homes in order to make sure that there's enough. And you have to make sure that you have a good infrastructure and good funding source to keep doing it. And requiring Housing New Zealand to provide a dividend has been one of the worst decisions of this government because it has prevented Housing New Zealand from engaging in their core function, which is making sure that New Zealanders, those who need it, have a decent and safe and secure home to live in. So I urge members of the House to support this. I urge National to support it. It is, after all, national policy now, according to Stephen Joyce. So they should have no problem supporting a bill that does exactly what Stephen Joyce has said he wants to do. I look forward to their support in the future. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Chair.
Kelvin
Mr.
Davis.
Chair. Mr. Chair.